Hello.
Welcome to our talk today. I'm Dr. Carrie York, and I am speaking with Dr. Mohammed Faruque, who is a professor at the University of Cincinnati. And he is also teaching two of our modules in our Islamic psychology program at the Al-Karam Institute. One of those modules is on sort of Islamic philosophy of science. And the other module is on the self and human ontology. So, mashallah, you really have, you're the real philosopher. You are teaching two of the modules that really address the philosophical roots of Islamic psychology. Now, I have to say, at the very beginning, I am not a philosopher. I'm a psychologist. I think it's absolutely necessary that psychologists do study philosophy. If you want to be a psychologist, you need to study philosophy. It's especially important for understanding at least your own worldview, which is the context in which you operate, right, as a psychologist. But that's not the same thing as being a philosopher, right? Somebody, the corpus of philosophy, I would say, that's on a different level than I suppose we psychologists could ever expect to be at. But so today we're talking with Dr. Faruque on his new book, Sculpting the Self, Islam, Selfhood, and Human Flourishing, mashallah. And this is one of the required readings in our module on the self and human ontology. So that's wonderful. So welcome.
Thank you so much, Dr. Carrie, and thanks for having me here. Really excited about this interview.
Looking forward to it. Well, one of the things that I had just mentioned about, psychologists needing to have, a good understanding of philosophy. So, if you're in a program and you're studying to become a psychologist, you definitely need to, take various courses in philosophy, look at different aspects of things from a philosophical lens. There's this idea in psychology that psychology is thin, where we go into things maybe in a more focused way, whereas philosophy, I think, is much more broad. So it's very interesting to go through, having looked through the book, and mashallah, it's very deep. It's a wonderful book, very deep, very rich, very philosophical, right? No doubt, like a philosophical book actually being philosophical. But yeah, mashallah, it's wonderful. Can you maybe for those who haven't gotten the book or anything, let's start off by just providing sort of a brief synopsis of the book and also what the impetus of the book was.
Sure. Your first comment was actually very important, but I think we'll come back to it, the philosophical underpinnings of psychology and especially when it comes to the question of what is the nature of a human being, what is human nature, is there such a thing as human nature, or what is man in the androgenic sense. But let's begin with by providing very brief synopsis of this book and why I thought that a book of this nature needs to be written. And as you can imagine, there are many reasons. So let's begin with the story of how I came to, this idea of human subjectivity itself, and then kind of why I thought I should write a book from an Islamic perspective. So I was an economics undergraduate student actually at the University of London back in 2008, when, as you might remember, there was this global financial crisis, and everyone was thinking what's going on. But a lot of people were lost faith in economic, especially econometric models that are supposed to predict, all of this crisis, and they failed to do so. And so I just, I had an curiosity about other sciences, because especially these days, if you look at undergraduates, if someone is studying physics or someone is studying just, psychology, they're worldview and everything is confined to that particular narrow area field. And it does not help them to kind of see things from the outside. But because I had a kind of innate interest in more or less, this thing, everything else, I'd say, I just felt like, there's the dimension of human psychology. Actually, that's what is missing in all of these econometric models that are heavily based on kind of quantitative factors. But here, essentially, we're dealing with human behavior. And so it was very unsatisfactory. And apart from this one Yale psychologist, namely Robert Shiller, no one actually talked about it. But I just felt like, if you really want to understand even what's going on in the economic sphere outside in the external world, you cannot do it with just, without taking into consideration some conception of human subjectivity. And I just felt like there's something wrong with the overarching paradigm in economics itself. It does not lead to kind of satisfactory responses in most of the cases. And I just felt like I have to understand the kind of more foundational stuff, the fundamental, aspects of most of these sciences. And I just felt like, all right, up to this point, my education has been kind of, very much based on the Western tradition. I went to an English school, completed my O-levels, A-levels. I just wanted to then see, all right, when it comes to like looking at the foundations of science, methodology that we use and so forth, in other words, philosophy in the widest sense, maybe let's look at it from the Islamic perspective. Let's try to learn Arabic, Persian. So once I completed my degree, I went to Iran. I spent 3 years. I did have some knowledge of Arabic, but I kind of improved on my Arabic and Persian and went through this rigorous training in philosophy and mysticism, reading all of this Arabic, Persian texts with some of the best philosophers in Iran. And then, I came to the States. I went to, did my PhD at UC Berkeley on conceptions of subjectivity in Islamic philosophy and mysticism, etc. And so now, it gives me the perspective to kind of compare what's going on, like, let's say, in Islamic psychology and psychology in the Western tradition. What are some of the foundations that people kind of usually don't kind of pay attention to, but that kind of affect the way they think about the mind, consciousness, and so on and so forth. So I feel like, it's a very deep and technical issue, so I don't want to get into it, but I do try to address it in the book. Like, before we do science, before we do anything, actually, there are the fundamental epistemological questions. How do we know anything at all? What are the kind of sources of knowledge? What are the parameters? What are the conditioning factors, and so forth? Usually we don't, these are epistemological questions that even people who do physics today kind of assume certain things about where the world works, like mathematical models are supposed to kind of resemble a reality out there, and the senses is the main medium through which we kind of receive information. Then we use logic and so forth. But it's kind of a little bit deeper than that. So, but those are general epistemological questions. On top of all that, there is also the question of self-knowledge. That's absolutely basic. And that has been emphasized again and again by most of the Islamic philosophers. Like, if we don't have this most basic knowledge of ourselves as a particular human being, capable of experiencing the world ourselves, how is it possible to even make any judgment, say that, the mind, the mind is XYZ, or the consciousness is, has a particular definition, any of this, or the world has this particular, nature and so forth. None of these, kind of propositions would bear any kind of substance without this kind of basic self-knowledge. It's kind of at the base of more or less everything, literally everything, including psychology, of course, like one of the most fundamental questions. All right, we're talking about the mind, we're talking about the psyche, but how do we know ourselves? How do we come to know? What's the kind of, are there conditioning factors? What is the kind of main, like process and so on and so forth. So these are some of the issues that have been dealt with indeed in depth. But it's at the end of the day, the book is about proposing a new model of the self, or human nature. These days, you probably have noticed, people use the word self in all sorts of ways. So one of the ways that people kind of conflate between human nature, man or human being, is kind of using it synonymously with the word self. So when I say what is the self, it's sometimes essentially it means what is human nature, or what is a human being. So I proposed a new model called the spectrum model, because and there are lots of different kind of factors. Maybe I'll just outline them. So let's say starting from the situation within Islamic studies, and which is a vast field itself. People study within Islamic studies, Islamic philosophy, Islamic psychology, etc. So I noticed that because I had that interest in subjectivity going back to my undergrad years, I realized that when people use the term self, there are all sorts of ways they use it. Like, it's not at all clear when you look at different literatures in different disciplines. Like you're reading some book on Islamic psychology, and then you go Sufism, and then you go to Islamic philosophy, and then maybe some book on anthropology in Islam. And you see the word self occurring in English or some in French and German version. And you see how haphazard it is. And then you thought, all right, maybe let's go back to the original source of the Arabic version. And then you also realize it's very complicated. So I felt like, there is a kind of insurmountable methodological issue involved here. Like it's not at all clear whether an anthropologist, when he or she is talking about the self, is the same thing that someone else also has in mind when they're talking about it in the context of Sufism or Islamic psychology and so on and so forth. And now this situation applies not just Islamic studies. You actually read other books in other contexts, like Western psychology or Western philosophy. Again, different disciplines, same word, but having all sorts of different connotations. On top of that, there are people saying, "Oh, there is no such thing as self." Nietzsche and Daniel Dennett and all of these people. Other people have different definitions, very different from each other, et cetera, et cetera. So I felt like, I want to approach it from a global perspective, like, something that everyone, at least at the basic level, everyone can relate to. So that you do through the most basic phenomenological experience, and then using the tools in logic and so forth. So I kind of make clear that, this is what I call a spectrum concept, having all of these different connotations. It's a complex, through a kind of rather complex philosophical analysis, I derive a multidimensional model having 5 different levels. But before doing so, I also make clear that when we're talking about the self, sometimes people use it in a descriptive sense, at other times in a normative sense. And that distinction is absolutely crucial. We talk about it, like when we talk about fitra and all of this, whether this is kind of scientific talk or it's kind of normative. By normative, I don't mean in the kind of subjective, but just that, sometimes you can talk about the self in terms of physical processes, like what processes can underlie some of our cognitive, mental, activities, and what social factors sometimes affect our, understanding of ourselves, cognitive process, et cetera. But, and people think, especially in scientific disciplines, and I also brought neuroscience here, deal with it heavily. The longest chapter is about neuroscience of consciousness. So there's the descriptive dimension, and then there's the normative dimension, under which you have ethical and spiritual. So that's where, the kind of philosophical ruminations, spiritual ruminations on the self kind of make sense. But under the descriptive dimension, you have biophysiological, and then the sociocultural, and then cognitive experiential. Psychology is kind of subsumed under cognitive and experiential dimensions. So you have this multimodal structure of the self that I provide by kind of dealing with different disciplines in different contexts, both Western, non-Western, including Indian philosophy sometimes, and then both modern and what I call non-modern, because pre-modern is an already derogatory term. So I go back to even ancient, Greek philosophers, sometimes Plato, and of course, Islamic philosophy is kind of the big chunk of the book.
Beautiful. So, you propose this kind of spectrum or multi-dimensional model of the self. And I'm curious that, I know that you had put this book together. It's some of your work that probably predates your let's say, engagement with this field that we today call Islamic psychology. And I know that you totally got up to speed with the field and where it's at, and who some of the people are in it and what some of their contributions are. And so I'm wondering how your book engages with that. So, for example, there's been different models of the self proposed and written about. For example, my good friend Abdullah Rothman, his doctoral work was also about the development of the self. Mashallah, he's published some articles, and he just came out with his book on his model of the self. Other people, my other good friend Human Keshavarzi and Fahad Khan, they have also written about a very similar kind of structure of the self with the nafs and the ruh and the qalb and the aql. And then people like Muhammad Yassin and others have written about fitra and Amber Haq. They have their book with Islamic personality and so on and so forth. And so there are these existing models of the self that many of us in the field of Islamic psychology, have written about. Usually most of us, or many of us, are psychologists in the field, not, coming from, an Islamic studies background or a philosophy background. So I wonder how your book is in conversation with all of that, with their models that they've put forth. So that's one question. And then the other question that kind of touches upon that is, I'm curious how your book may have been different had you maybe been engaged in this field prior. Do you know what I mean? Like, where you're now reading at the field and what's going on, do you think that would have impacted the work at all? Would it have had maybe a different angle or a different conversation? Maybe not. And not to suggest that one is good or bad. It's just that, you know what I mean? It's now you're finding a whole other platform or home in which your book is very useful, but maybe you weren't fully speaking to that field when you were putting the book together. So I'm curious how that experience is for you now that you are kind of, finished this book and upon its completion found this whole other field where it has great utility. So I guess those would be two questions, if you could maybe touch upon that.
Yes, those are great questions. And I should say I have had some familiarity with some of the work of these scholars that you have mentioned. And as you know, Islamic psychology itself is an emerging field. It starts in Malik Badri. I mean, most people would consider him as the kind of founding father. He passed away recently, and his book, The Dilemma of Muslim Psychologists, is one of the most important books. He is probably the first to use the term Islamic psychology, who actually faced tremendous opposition at that time, the 60s. Mm-hmm. And as which was the case in many other people when they're talking about Islamic science and the so-called Islamization of sciences and so on and so forth, because you had this army of secular Muslims around in different countries, Egypt, Syria, and other places, who would think, "Oh, what are you talking about? Psychology is psychology, physics is physics, science is science." What is Islamic about it? So, so this already presupposes that in a post-Protestant understanding of religion being confined to the personal space, private space, nothing to do with kind of ethics, politics, and this kind of public sphere and so forth. And William James, and also an important figure in modern psychology, is kind of to a large extent responsible for varieties of religious experience. That book kind of psychologizes a lot of these things. Like, yeah, you can have a psychology of these things, but religion itself is kind of, it's your private beliefs and this stuff. We do science, as kind of scientists. It doesn't matter whether you're Muslim or not. But then, if you dig deeper, you kind of realize the assumptions. So we talk a great deal about the difficulty of defining something like Islamic psychology. But in doing so, we realize that there can be legitimate reasons why there should be at least a call for something like Islamic psychology as distinct from Western psychology. Because when you study Freud, Jung, and actually, these figures have, they have to be also situated in the larger context of Western thought and philosophy, like Nietzsche prior to them, and Kant, and all of this, we don't usually go into all of it. We just go straight to Freud, but like, what is his context anyway, when you ask those questions and when you're aware of the larger Western tradition, then you realize, wow, there are different sets of the different set of epistemological and ontological assumptions guiding the work of these Western psychologists, and Malik Badri and Rothman and others have pointed out again and again. You talk about Freud and his theory of the self, the iceberg model, like everyone knows perhaps, because everyone on the internet, id and an ego and superego, that is structure, and then you feel like, and then his whole idea of psychosexual development of the soul, and so of course Freud is no longer taken that seriously in most circles, even in the Western context. But if you come from an Islamic background and you have familiarity with the Quran and terms like nafsul ammara, the evil enticing soul, the lower soul, nafsul mutma'inna, the tranquil, peaceful soul, and those terms, and anyway, the kind of general picture of the self or the soul, sometimes these two words can be different, but let's say this kind, I don't want to complicate things, but yeah, it's like you know that it's not the same thing. And that itself requires a lot of kind of discernment. And I just bear with me if you're taking you through a little bit of kind of winding road. But there are lots of interesting anecdotes. I'm not anecdotes, like historical precedents that I can mention, like why these distinctions in words are so important. So in the 1930s, there were actually a lot of Egyptian psychologists who also had an interest in Sufism and so forth, but they kind of went to Paris, or they went to various Western countries, and then they became familiar with Freud, and then they came back to Egypt, and then they thought, oh, now they have to talk about these things in terms of in Arabic and using suitable terms. And nafs would be the term that they use, and sometimes, so there's this figure in Egypt, Yusuf something, I forgot, but anyway, he was one of the leading figures who was kind of trying to propagate Western psychology using Sufi terms, Islamic mystical terms. So for unconsciousness, he found a very interesting term from Ibn Arabi, one of the most important mystical figures in Islam. The word is la shurur, literally means unconsciousness. Now there's a book called Arabic Freud, just got published, and I also have
the Arabic Freud by
Omnia.
Yes, Omnia. Yes, I know Omnia.
It is at UC Davis, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
It's very interesting and well written, but there is some conceptual kind of stuff that I felt like needed to be addressed. So there are those people trying to kind of teach Western psychology using Sufi terminology. There are also some Sufis who thought, oh, there are lots of nice kind of correspondences. Oh, nafs is exactly perhaps the same as Freudian ego sometimes, nafsul ammara, or unconsciousness is perhaps the same. But you actually read the source text, or if you're aware of the kind of context of these Arabic terms in their proper context, you know that they're actually, it's very different. And it's way more context. The way that terms are used, let's say even nafs in these Sufi writings, it's very different. So if you are not aware of these nuances, then you think it's kind of the same thing. Psychology is simply psychology.
So then how do you feel about the idea that some, I'm sure you've read in some of the publications that there's a lot of different ways that Islamic psychology is conceptualized. And one of those ways is that it's kind of like Sufism, that Sufism is kind of Islam's version of psychology. So this speaks directly to what you're saying about how these early psychologists in Egypt or whatever 100 years ago were trying to use that language, the language that existed in Sufism, to talk about, Western psychology, at least in terms of the lexicon and the words. So what are your thoughts on that then? Do you think that they're completely dissimilar kind of systems, or can they interact on some level, or is that just totally problematic because they're, just, systems completely? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So to some extent that, some Rothman but they have kind of addressed this. So kind of summarize my particular response about that. I would say it's complicated. It's neither kind of complete, like non-overlap or just perfect overlap. I would say one has to be aware of the contextual, context of these terms. So if you thinking of Freudian ego and id, probably you can subsume, and you're thinking of drives, impulses, even unconscious drives and so forth. There are lots of terms, like even nafsul ammara and khawatir and like if you kind of use them in the broadest sense, they cover some of these things. But there is something called nafsul mutma'inna and higher states of the consciousness. So those things, again, you don't see in Freud. And the whole idea of this psychosexual development, Oedipus complex, that's just out of nowhere. This just strikes you as like, how do you make sense of something like which is so crucial, and which even new Freudians, or even today when it comes to positive psychology, perhaps this requires another discussion. I mean, Freud's legacy is still, it lives on in many ways and so forth.
I think you give too much credit to Freud. I mean,
so yeah. So people can see that.
Really, I mean, he's not. I mean, yeah, he's a big figure in that everybody knows his name. He's become popular culture, but I think in the field of psychology, like actual psychologists, I think his role is more popular in popular culture than in psychology itself. I mean, of course, we learn about him and that sort of thing, but I think he's kind of taken a back seat. I think he's more popular in popular culture.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think I mentioned it also, like Freud is no longer taken as kind of serious. Psychoanalysis itself.
Yes, and psychoanalysis and even related union and that sort of thing. I mean, there's definitely that element of, the unconscious mind and those kind of ideas are there. But whether it's specifically, Freud's take on that, I think.
Yeah, especially, with the arrival of neuropsychology or the advances in neuroscience, and also therapeutic techniques like CBT, cognitive, therapy and other modes of therapy, Freudian psychoanalysis has been severely criticized, especially because of lack of empirical evidence and so forth. So but anyway, but what I was trying to mention is that you study, if you are aware of the kind of ontological assumptions, philosophical assumptions of the Freudian or other paradigms in Western psychology, and you also know something about Islamic conceptions of the self, it's not very difficult to see that there are some fundamental differences between the conceptions of the self in these things, in these kind of different two different paradigms. So then when you were talking about Islamic psychology, it does make sense. So the most important question is, how are we going to define the self at all levels? So when we talk, the theory that I propose can be actually very helpful here, because I do kind of incorporate these elements of socioculture and society culture, and then the biophysiological processes, and then the experiences that are kind of common to everyone, regardless of their religious beliefs. No Muslim psychologist, I think, would deny those kind of universal descriptive dimensions of the self. But then there's also the normative dimension. There's also what it means to be a self. So when you're talking about the self, it's not something that is fully given. It's part of it is kind of received, part of it is a matter of achievement. What I call also the aspiration, like aspirational self. So we talk about the ethical and the spiritual dimension. And that's absolutely essential when it comes to thinking about human flourishing, meaning in life, having, without any self-conception at whatever level, like at least at the very basic level, some kind of self-image. It's hard to think, where I'm going, what I want from my life and so forth, choices that I make and so forth. So I provide that kind of superstructure, I'd say. but if you take that into consideration, and then I go into the more specific ideas of what is a human being within the Islamic tradition. So you can see kind of overlaps in terms of some aspects of the self. All right, yeah, of course, and so some terminologies, or they can always be some kind of transference of knowledge from Western into Islamic side, and vice versa. So that I think one should kind of, there shouldn't be any kind of controversy about that. The fact that there's no need to reject everything in Western psychology or Western philosophy or Western thought. A lot of this is some of this is kind of neutral. But as regards other things, yes, there are specific Islamic conceptions of what is a human being. We talk about the fitra, but more than that, there's the idea of what I call, or what I think William Chittick has used this term, an anthropocosmic understanding of the self. So the self that ultimately is proposed by kind of a wide variety of Islamic authors, both from Sufism and Islamic philosophy, it's not a kind of individualistic self. It is, I use the term anthropocentric, but at the same time, keeping in mind, it is also anthropocosmic, because you start with your experiences and so forth, self-consciousness, etc. But then the end point is something much bigger than kind of individual well-being and so forth. There's kind of expansion that takes place. There's correspondences between who we are and everything else in nature, and there are also kind of correspondences between us and you can say aspects of divine nature, like when it comes to the theory of the perfect human, the understanding is that human beings, among everything else, has the capacity, has the receptivity to reflect and be a perfect mirror for all the divine names and attributes. And that is the kind of ultimate goal of being a human and so forth. So, I mean, that's kind of metaphysical, but it's related. Now, coming back to the kind of, where we are, where we normally stand. Yes, there's a lot of psychophysical processes that happen, and I would say that I do deal with lots of this issues in the book, especially when I'm talking about the structure of consciousness. So yeah, when it comes to Rothman and Kashavarzi, their models, I find them really, really illuminating and very helpful, especially if you are thinking of the clinical context, because you need kind of specific maps of the self, maps of the soul.
Yes. Well, that was going to be one of my questions, is that, a large aspect of psychology is applied. So it's like we can have the philosophical underpinnings of any model of the self, right? Or whatever concept is. But then how do we bring that into something that is useful in an applied sense when we're talking about, helping people?
Yes, exactly. But then, but one has to be aware of the philosophical, ontological, and epistemological assumptions, so forth. But once, the groundwork has been laid, and once we understand the big question of what is the self in the kind of widest sense, then we can think about specific models. So I try to provide, because I'm kind of not
like
just
a super model, like a bigger
model. Because the philosophical, epistemological questions are very important to me. But I believe they're also extremely important for Islamic psychologists themselves, to be aware of the assumptions of what defines.
Well, I would argue psychology in general. That's what one of my, if you want to say one of my beefs is with my own profession, is that there are a lot of assumptions that go unchallenged or unexamined, right? And that has to do with psychologists not actually studying philosophy at all. There's just kind of like this general, unexamined, not very well articulated assumption of how things are, and that's kind of like the starting point where the profession begins. And so I think that's one of my criticisms of psychology in general, that I really think that it needs to be a field that examines itself more deeply. And I think that there's room for plurality, right, of philosophical diversity. I mean, we talk about diversity and inclusion all the time. And I think really what an aspect of diversity that is yet to be explored in the field of psychology is philosophical diversity. Why? Because philosophy is being ignored. So it's not that there's no diversity, it's that there is no philosophy, diverse or otherwise. And so I think that this is one of the things that Islamic psychology can highlight and challenge sort of the mainstream. I hate that word because I don't like to otherize Islamic psychology. I like to, think of it as it's part of mainstream. It's part of, it's psychology, right? But I think that that's one of the things that we can contribute and maybe change is to say, look, we need to examine this missing yet fundamental element of psychological science, and that is our philosophical assumptions. And I think if this can be recognized, you can, this is where it can be like a game changer in terms of advancing the field of psychology in general, right? Because then when you articulate what these different perspectives are, you can see that there's space for a variety of views. But now everybody's trying to cram into the view of that which is not articulated. Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
Like this general, I don't know, philosophical kinds of, does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I'm completely on the same page as with you on this. And I would say, it's extremely important that we ask, if we are psychologists, whether Western or Islamic, coming from Western or Islamic backgrounds, we ask this question or self-reflect that what the kind of psychology that one wants to have actually depends on the big question of how we are defining the self in the widest sense, not in a narrowly
and other
sense. The self is multidimensional.
Yes, the self and other philosophical roots.
Yes.
And that's why these, this first semester of our program, it's called, they're modules that explore the philosophical roots, because you have to know the roots before you can get to the branches. And the branches are the things that we're so familiar with, the more applied aspects like spirituality and mental health, or Islamically integrated psychotherapy, or some of these other things. These are the more readily accessible roots, readily accessible branches, but we haven't, what are the roots? That's the starting point, right? And the roots are the philosophy. And not just related to ontology. I would say that ontology is kind of a next step. Before we can even get to ontology and what is the nature of the human being, we have to understand things before that as well, right?
Yes, completely agree.
Yeah, more general metaphysical concepts about the world and God and creation, and then comes in the human being, right?
Yes, it's a tall order, and so I mean there are a couple of things, but I'm so glad you're mentioning these things, especially about pluralism. I saw at the very beginning of my first chapter, in this introduction, I defined my methodology. I explained my methodology, and I defined something called epistemic pluralism. Because there's this assumption, before we even have all of these discussions, there are a lot of people, including someone as famous as Charles Taylor, who wrote this 500, 600-page book on the sources of modern self, one of the best-selling, authors on this topic. And then there is the army of sociology who actually claim that this whole thing is Western. Actually, what are you talking about? In other cultures, they haven't even progressed to the point where they have a self-conception. It's a modern thing. It just came into being in the last 500 years. Individualism and this and that, et cetera, self-determination, and the kind of inner depths, the capacity for self-articulation. It's all in the Romantic movement, especially. So this is all kind of Western, and other cultures, if they want to have a notion of this, they actually need to catch up. So I address that explicitly. Is the self a modern invention? And if refute that, this is it's a very parochial, Eurocentric conception of history and everything, like going back to Hegel and his philosophy. Hegel is an important philosopher, wrote important things. Hegel should not be confused with popularizers like Marx and others who turn upside down Hegel's philosophy. But unfortunately, his view was extremely Eurocentric. And unfortunately, a lot of people in the Islamic world, because the education in the post-colonial situation, it's kind of Western, and people really do not learn anything about the contributions of Muslim psychologies or anything valuable about these big questions from the Islamic tradition. So there is that. And then also within the Western paradigm itself, the narrow compartmentalization of disciplines and what someone like C.P. Snow called the two cultures, like the kind of sharp differentiation between division between humanities and the sciences, and then within humanities, like as you're saying, we study psychology or we study economics, and we just we don't ask the kind of principles of this science. But if you go back to Aristotle, and then you follow the Islamic philosophers, the sciences like psychology. So we should first ask, how do you situate Islamic psychology within the larger paradigm of various Islamic sciences? And are there kind of distinct relationship between these sciences or not? And that question is not even asked. We just kind of start as though every science is kind of self-contained. It has its own principle. No, as you were saying before,
it's all multidisciplinary. It's all integrated.
Yes, before you come to the.
It should be.
Yes, it should be. Like in the Islamic tradition, there's a link between ilahiyat or metaphysics, and then tabi'iyat, and then riyadiyat, mathematical sciences, natural sciences, and then logic. There's a kind of hierarchy and there's a kind of interrelationship. So psychology is actually placed in most of these paradigms within the context of Islamic philosophy in natural sciences, because it deals with body and so forth. But then it's also not fully physical. So later thinkers kind of took notice of that, and it's kind of between physics and metaphysics and so forth. But anyway, before you ask this question, I said there are epistemological questions. But before you're going to specify what is God, and then what is the nature of the world, there's the question of existence, wujud in Islamic philosophy. Yes. In today's language, we call ontology. On is a Greek word for being, And Islamic philosophy has developed, perhaps especially in later period, one of the most sophisticated version of any philosophy of existence, especially with Mullah Sadra, because these are the foundations. But anyway, perhaps one does not need to know everything, the details, unless one is interested in philosophy. But if we're talking about the foundations, principles, we have to know like what grounds what, what underlies what. Like we're talking about nafs, we are talking about even in a consciousness.
But what is that rooted in? Yes.
Yeah. So
that's really that's the kind of program we've put together, and that you're playing a very integral part in, is addressing what is.
Exactly.
So we can build science of psychology on that.
Yes. So I think we should pay more attention also to what I would call the rise of modern subjectivity. As you were saying, why is it that we're just taking psychology as a kind of self-contained subject and not even aware of the assumptions? So these things have a particular genealogy. You have to go back to the last 400 years. So you go back to Descartes, one of the most influential.
Yes, I'm aware of how that happened.
Yeah. So when you have that sharp divide, res cogitans and res extensa, the sharp divide between thinking thing as what he called the self, and then everything else is kind of separate from us as kind of res extensa, extended thing. So you have, you just feel like, when it comes to mind, psyche, it's just me. It's kind of, all about me. And Descartes, the way he kind of defined his methodology was very problematic, but now it's foundational almost in everywhere. So for him to determine the question of what is the nature of the self, all you need is a kind of functioning rational mind. That's enough to determine who you are. And
I think therefore I am.
Yeah, and then he comes to realize, oh, it's a thinking substance. But as you know, others quickly pointed out, Locke and Hume and then Kant. I deal with all of this extensively.
Yes.
And when it comes to Islamic philosophy, it's a very different paradigm. Although you began sometimes like Sohrawardi with consciousness, there's no wrong with that. You can begin with kind of phenomenology, like the experiences that are basic to everyone, but not kind of through a process of doubting and as with Descartes and so forth. Anyway, so you kind of, once one is aware of all of that, once the foundation is laid, then we can think about the specific kind of applications. That's where I think, Rothman, Kashavarzi, and others, especially I like the models by Kashavarzi and also Rothman. So Rothman, for example, basing...
And they're wonderful people too.
Yes, they are.
They have great models and great work, and they're wonderful people too.
Yes, indeed. I mean, I really love watching their programs and interviews. So yeah, I personally think that, it's important to see, for example, when Rothman is proposing his own model, he calls it an Islamic model of the self, which is largely based on Al-Ghazali. This is fine. And he also has an iceberg model, which I find really, really, really exciting when it comes to, because it's in clinical context, that seems really, really like appropriate. But anyway, so the model that he proposes, with like, different kind of terms like in heart and intellect and then different levels of nafs, the tranquil self and nafs al-ammara, and then the process of purification, and the fitra, the innate nature on top. So this is all fine.
You studied his model.
Right?
I said, you studied his model very well.
Yeah, I love it. But I would also want us to explore other possible models, because I think that, if we're thinking
and
about...
I'm sure he's very aware that there are other models as well. And I'm sure he would love to participate in a conversation that was about, whether his model and how that might have similarities or differences with other, Islamic models, right?
Exactly. Because a lot of the times people think, oh, you're using the word Islamic. Perhaps you mean the Islamic. No, just as in psychology, there are different models.
Yeah.
There are different, even, like behavior therapy, CBT, psychoanalysis, neuropsychiatry, et cetera. There are different, and they're helpful because there are different types of people, different kind of psyches coming from different.
Yes.
So we need to kind of outsource. And so I feel like, wow, the tradition is so huge. Ghazali actually died in the 11th century, 12th century, early 12th. After him, especially Ibn Arabi and Mullah Sadra and so many other figures who have dealt with, psychology. And so there are so many other possibilities. I personally have dealt with Shah Waliullah and Mullah Sadra and proposed two distinct models, yes, kind of within this the kind of superstructure that I proposed. So I think that, the more diversity we have, the better when it comes to contributing not just to the Muslims, but also the kind of wider Western, psychology. And I think that's very important. I think that just as Muslims today, they have valuable things to learn from Western psychology or Western science in general, it's not one way. There are also very important things that Westerners are anyone trained in Western traditions, they can learn from various Islamic sciences and also Islamic psychology. And that's absolutely important, the reciprocal, attitude.
Well, so, I mean, just, because we're, to sort of wrap things up, coming to the end of our time, I'd actually like to finish things off kind of back where we started, and that is economics. So now that you've taken this whole long journey on exploring the self and, publishing the book and spending years looking at this from different angles, I wonder what your thoughts are on taking all that you've learned back to economics. So is there an Islamic version of the self, and how that's understood or conceptualized that could be useful in the field of economics? Maybe a model of the self for economic theories or something or other. I mean, is there some way that you can take all of that back into the field of economics? Have you thought about that?
These days, to be honest with you, I have not a specific. I was more thinking about other, especially psychology. But now that you mentioned, actually, why not? Because that was one of my issue was that you have all this kind of overly quantified like models that are just based on quantitative factors. Even
Isn't
in
there something called like behavioral economics or something?
yes, I was
like
going to
that?
mention it. I was going to
Where
mention
you
it.
understand, when you understand the nature of the self and how the self operates, if you're rooting that paradigm in an Islamic, philosophical, perspective, what does that mean for how we understand economics?
Yeah, so just
Maybe
as
that's your next discovery. Maybe it's been discovered. I don't know. I don't know anything about economics.
yeah, but with behavior is actually a lot of these economic models, the Homo economicus, that's quote unquote the economic version of the human being. It is dependent on these psychological models, which in turn depends on particular ontology and epistemology. But if it comes to behaviorism, as you know, with Skinner and Watson and others,
The behavior
there is no self.
behavior and
There
not
is no self. It's just behavior, and that's part of the problem. And because it's so hyper empiricist, it even denies that we have something like consciousness.
Yeah,
and
but
so,
that's why I think what you've written about has there's a potential opportunity to maybe change that narrative. I mean, because if all that's being talked about in economics as it relates to the self is this more behavioral approach, what happens to economics when we change that and we talk about a self that has a soul?
yeah, I think it will
I don't
change a lot of
know.
things.
I'm not an
A lot of things.
economist.
Yeah, your aspirations would not be just kind of accumulation of material wealth, material well-being,
But there's
because you
something
know that
beyond that.
to talk about happiness itself, you have to posit a deeper self. It cannot be, and people talk about different kinds of pleasure and satisfaction that in Islamic, philosophy. So yeah, there's a lot even in economics that can be incorporated, because I actually personally think that as ideas about the nature of ultimate reality, God and self, these are foundational issues that apply to kind
That
of
transcend
times.
discipline.
Yes.
Yes.
But I personally think now that I personally propose, in addition to the supermodel spectrum model, what I call, there are, especially in my dissertation, two additional models based on my reading of Mullah Sadra and Shah Waliullah. So some of them can be, I think, very relevant to even clinical context, and that's my next step in a way. So they talk about all of these different terms, different dimensions of the self, like nafs, apple, qalb, and then other dimensions like khafi, akhfa, hidden and most hidden, like higher levels of consciousness in terms of what they call subtle lataif, or the subtle fields of consciousness. It's a term. So what we need to do is to kind of express these theories in a contemporary language that you can easily follow. Because if you use these terms, you need a specialist, and like average person or someone just working as a therapist will not be able to kind of make sense of. But once you are able to kind of express and make, and that's what I find so hopeful, like about the work of Rothman and Kashaverzi. Like, all right, the tradition is huge. There's a lot to learn and a lot to explore. It's it's a 1400-year-old tradition, extends way beyond Ghazali, but there's still a lot that we need to kind of digest, engage, and kind of make relevant. So I personally think when it comes to consciousness, that is something I thought it's kind of missing currently, the theories of consciousness and also theories of intelligence. So, in the work of some of these people that,
especially when it comes to like different ways of knowing spiritual
intelligence. Yes.
Sort
So consciousness, especially, and also, of course, theories of intelligence, also theories of knowledge. So some of my future projects will kind
you
of.
You can see the field of transpersonal psychology. Deals a lot with different ways of knowing and that sort of thing. So, listen, the book is called Sculpting the Self, Islam, Selfhood, and Human Flourishing, and it is by University of Michigan Press. Dr. Mohammed Faruque was also a professor at University of Cincinnati and teaching in our Islamic psychology program at the Al-Karam Institute. So thank you very much for sharing your wisdom with us and letting us learn from you. And
you're very welcome, and thanks for having me here. It was wonderful having this conversation with you.